I'll go over setting up a really simple health system inside Playmaker or using Playmaker, and I'm going to make a lot of assumptions. This is just a real straightforward recipe to cover kind of the nuts and bolts, just the procedural stuff to get a really simple health system up and running. So the first thing I'll do is I'm going to create a cube object, and the cube is going to act as the trigger that I want to pick up. And so I'll establish this system where if we pick up a good cube, we add to our health, and if we pick up a bad cube, it will take away from our health, and it will give us the basic mechanic to be able to, basic mechanic that we can use in any game where we're, avoiding the bad stuff and trying to get the good stuff. So the basic setup here is I have this cube, and I'll just set it close to the ground, and I have a first-person controller. With that cube selected, I'll make sure that I set it as a trigger. So I'm going into the box collider component, setting that cube as a trigger, and we'll use some basic trigger events inside Playmaker. So the first thing I'll do is I'll set this up as, this will be my good cube. This is the thing that I want to pick up. And I've set up a couple of materials here. I have just a simple red and green material, and I'll use the red one in a bit. But I'll set this one up as just a simple green material. So at this point it's set up as a trigger, and I should be able to just pass right through it. So I'm not colliding with it, but I should have encountered a trigger event there. So what I'll do is I'll select my good cube here, and I'm going to jump into Playmaker, and I'm going to set up a real simple state machine. The first state is going to sit and wait for a collision. So a trigger. So I'm just going to search for trigger, or I'll go under the physics category here. I'll just scroll down and jump into physics, and inside physics I'm looking for a trigger event. So I'll add that trigger event, and on trigger event I want to collide with not an untagged item. I'll tag this with player, and I need to make sure that whatever's acting as my player character, whether it's first or third person, in this case I have a first person controller, I'm just going to confirm that I have tagged it player, and I have not yet done that, so I'll go under tags and I'll make sure that I have my first person controller tagged with player. So let me go back over to my good cube here, and I'll go into my first state, and so on trigger enter with collider tag of player, I want to create a send event. So I'll create just a real simple custom event. We'll say has been triggered, and I'll go back to my state and add this as a transition. I'll add a second state and wire this event over to state 2. Inside my state 1, I'll just make sure that the send event for the trigger event is set to has been triggered. So the basic logic here is that when I run into this cube, it fires off a trigger event. So I have a cube that has is trigger, and I'll just test this logic really quickly. So hit the play button, and if I have Playmaker set up right, down in the Playmaker editor window, when I cross or trigger with the cube, I can see that it fires off state 2. So my mechanism is working properly. I just need to get the rest of the details in place. So the next thing that I need to do is I need to figure out some kind of health variable. And so my preference is to create an empty game object, and I'll set this up as my player manager. And my player manager is going to contain a simple machine that is going to track and manage health. So now the first thing that I want to do is I'll set my player manager up with a simple machine. Now before I get into actually establishing the entire content of the machine, what I want to do is I'm ultimately going to want to print my health to the screen, and I'll do that with a GUI label. And so I'm just going to go into the GUI category, and I'll add GUI label to state 1. And normally I would spend a little bit more time naming these states, but just to get this up and running very quickly, I'll just leave these at the default state names. So inside the GUI label in the text field, I'll just type in this is my GUI text. So I have a little something on screen that I can test and troubleshoot. And from the left, I'll send this over to, let's say, point 1, and point 1 from the top, and that should set some health information here somewhere in the top left-hand corner of my screen. So when I hit the play button, I should have a little GUI label that pops up, and it's rendering the content of my GUI label. Now, I actually don't want some fixed text here. What I want is this to render my health. And in order to get health up and running, what I need to do is I need to create a variable. And so I'm going to go to the Variables tab. Just a quick note, I'm still in the Player Manager here. And the first thing I'll do is I'll create a global variable. And the global variable that I'll create is player health, and I'll set that as a float. And I'll set the float value to, well, let's just say for the demo I'll set it to 80. That way when it's up and running I can see the content of that. So I just went into global variables. I created a player health variable, chose a float variable, and hit the add button. So I'll close the global variables because I don't want to create any more global variables. But I'm also going to need a local string variable. And we'll use this string. This will be the, we'll call this player health, but I'll call it string. I shouldn't actually capitalize the first letter of the player variable, so I'll take that down. So I have player health string. I'll choose that as a string type, and I'll add that. And that's just a local variable running on the Player Manager. And this player health string is actually going to render the output of our health float. Now, if I jump over to state and I go back to where my GUI label is being printed, instead of printing this hard-coded text in here, I'm going to click this little button off to the right, and I'm going to choose that new player health string that I just used. So in other words, at this point, what's going to happen is when that GUI label prints, it's going to look to the content of this player health string. Now, just to be able to troubleshoot this, I'm going to go over back to my Variables tab. I'm going to select my player health string, and the string that I want to print, I'll say this is the player health string. Exclamation point, ... So I have just a little string of text in here. If I go back to my state, I'll see that my GUI label is printing the player health string, and here's the actual output of it. It's the content of that string, and so when I hit the play button, this time around I should see the value of the player string being printed in my GUI label, and in fact I can see that. Okay, so now I just need to do one more thing in state 1 to get the content of my health float to print on screen. Remember, we're using a float because that's the actual number that we're going to manipulate with our pickup cube here. So what I want to do is I want to look in the convert category, and I want to convert a float to a string. And I'll just double click that. And so I've added that to state 1 of the Player Manager, but you can see that that's coming after the GUI label, and so I think it's just a good practice just to move this all the way up in front of the GUI label. So the first thing that happens on this state is that we're converting this float, and the float value that we want to convert is this global player health, and we want to convert that to this player health string. So in this case, it'll take the value of player health, which we're starting at 80. It's going to convert it to this string, and we'll do that every frame. And so now the result here is when I hit the play button, I should see the value of my player health float on the screen. Cool. So I see it. I see it's 80. That's pretty good. Everything's working with my Player Manager right now. So the next thing I'll do is the next presentation I'll set it up so that when we pick up our good cube, it actually adds to our health. But we'll do that in the next presentation.